The diner was buzzing with the usual lunchtime crowd, the air thick with the smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee. Behind the counter, a young waitress wiped sweat from her brow as she hurried between tables, her feet aching and her patience wearing thin. She had been on her feet since dawn, juggling orders and dealing with cranky customers. Her uniform was stained, her hair was a mess, and her smile, what little was left of it, was forced. In the corner booth sat an older man, scruffy and unassuming. His worn-out jacket and scuffed boots made him look like just another regular, someone who wouldn't stand out in a crowd. He was taking his time with his meal, savoring each bite of his burger as if he had all the time in the world. The waitress had already been to his table twice, refilling his coffee and asking if he needed anything else. Each time, he'd nodded politely but hadn't said much. By the third time she approached his table, her frustration had reached its peak. She was behind on orders, the kitchen was backed up, and the other customers were growing impatient. When she saw the man still slowly picking at his fries, something inside her snapped. "You know, sir," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "if you're not in a hurry, maybe you could come back later. Some of us actually have work to do." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. The chatter in the diner died down as heads turned toward the corner booth. The man looked up from his plate, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence was deafening. Then, with a calm that only someone with decades of experience could muster, he set his fork down and leaned back in his seat. "You're right," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not in a hurry. But maybe you should take a moment to breathe. Life's too short to rush through it." The waitress froze, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could say anything, the diner's manager appeared at her side, his face pale. "I'm so sorry, sir," the manager stammered, his voice trembling. "She didn't mean any disrespect." The man waved a hand dismissively. "It's fine. No harm done." The waitress stared at the manager, confused. Why was he acting so nervous? Who was this man? As the manager ushered her away from the table, she caught a glimpse of the other customers whispering to each other, their eyes wide with disbelief. Something was off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Little did she know, her life was about to change forever. The waitress's name was Linda, though most people at the diner just called her Lynn. She was in her early 30s, but life had already etched lines of worry onto her face. Her days were a blur of endless shifts, sleepless nights, and the constant weight of responsibility. She was a single mother to a 6-year-old boy named Tommy, and every ounce of her energy went into providing for him. Linda had once dreamed of becoming a writer. In high school, she'd filled notebooks with stories, tales of adventure, love, and hope. But life had other plans. When Tommy was born, she put her dreams on hold, trading her pen for an apron and her aspirations for the daily grind. The diner was just one of her jobs, she also cleaned offices at night and worked weekends at a local grocery store. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. That morning, like every morning, Linda had woken up before the sun. She'd packed Tommy's lunch, dropped him off at school, and rushed to the diner, where the breakfast rush was already in full swing. By the time lunch rolled around, she was running on fumes. Her feet ached, her back hurt, and her patience was hanging by a thread. The incident with the scruffy man in the corner booth wasn't the first time she'd lost her temper. Lately, it felt like the world was against her. The rent was due, her car was on its last legs, and Tommy had been asking for a new pair of shoes she couldn't afford. Every day was a battle, and she was tired of fighting. As she stood in the diner's cramped kitchen, waiting for the next round of orders, Linda replayed the scene in her mind. She couldn't believe she'd snapped at a customer like that. What had gotten into her? She prided herself on being professional, even on her worst days. But something about the man's calm demeanor had set her off. Maybe it was the way he seemed so at ease, so unbothered by the chaos around him. Or maybe it was the way he'd looked at her, as if he could see right through her tough exterior. The manager, a middle-aged man named Frank, pulled her aside during a lull in the rush. Lynn, you've got to be more careful, he said, his voice low but firm. You can't talk to customers like that. Especially not him. Linda frowned. Who is he, anyway? Why's everyone acting so weird? Frank hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was listening. That's Clint Eastwood, he said finally. Linda blinked, sure she'd misheard. What? Clint Eastwood, Frank repeated. The actor. The director. The guy who owns this place. Linda's stomach dropped. She felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? She'd heard rumors that the legendary actor owned a few businesses in town, but she'd never imagined he'd walk into her diner, let alone sit in her section. Oh no, she whispered, her hands trembling. I'm going to lose my job, aren't I? Frank sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. I don't know, Lynn. But you'd better hope he's in a forgiving mood. Linda's mind raced as she returned to the dining area. She glanced at the corner booth, where Eastwood was still sitting, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. She wanted to apologize, to explain herself, but she didn't know where to start. How do you say sorry to a living legend? As the afternoon wore on, Linda tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man in the corner booth. Who was he, really? Behind the scruffy beard and the worn-out jacket, there was something about him, a quiet strength, a sense of calm that seemed out of place in the noisy diner. By the time her shift ended, Linda was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She clocked out, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door, her mind still spinning. But as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she noticed something unusual. Clint Eastwood was standing by the curb, leaning against a beat-up pickup truck. He looked up as she approached, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers once again. Got a minute? He asked, his voice calm but commanding. Linda froze, her heart pounding in her chest. What could he possibly want with her? Linda hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. The last thing she wanted was another confrontation, especially with someone like Clint Eastwood. But there was something in his tone, a quiet authority, that made it impossible to say no. She nodded slowly, her throat dry, and followed him to the truck. Up close, he looked even more unassuming. His jacket was frayed at the edges, and his boots were caked with dirt. If she hadn't known who he was, she would have mistaken him for a ranch hand or a construction worker. But there was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that set him apart. Get in, he said, opening the passenger door. Linda blinked, surprised. You want me to? I'd like to talk, he replied, his tone firm but not unkind. And I'd rather not do it here. She glanced around, half expecting someone to stop her, but the street was empty. With a deep breath, she climbed into the truck, her mind racing. What could he possibly want to talk about? Was he going to fire her? Lecture her? She braced herself for the worst. The engine roared to life, and they pulled away from the diner, the silence between them heavy and awkward. Linda stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of her small town blur past. She'd lived here her whole life, but suddenly it felt like a different place, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. After a few minutes, Eastwood broke the silence. You've got a lot on your plate, don't you? Linda turned to look at him, surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean, he said, keeping his eyes on the road. You're working yourself to the bone. 2, maybe 3 jobs? A kid at home? She frowned, unsure how to respond. How do you know that? He shrugged. I've been around long enough to recognize the signs. You're tired, frustrated, and it's written all over your face. Linda looked away, her cheeks burning. She didn't like the idea of being so transparent, especially to someone like him. I'm doing what I have to do, she said quietly. Eastwood nodded, as if he understood. I get it. Life doesn't always go the way we plan. But that doesn't mean we have to let it break us. Linda didn't know what to say. She'd expected anger, maybe even a lecture, but this was something else entirely. There was a kindness in his words, a sense of understanding that caught her off guard. They drove in silence for a while, the truck winding its way through the outskirts of town. Eventually, they pulled up to a small, unassuming house nestled in the hills. It wasn't the grand mansion Linda had imagined a Hollywood legend would live in. It was modest, almost ordinary, with a porch that looked like it had seen better days. Eastwood parked the truck and turned to her. "Come on in," he said, opening his door. Linda hesitated, unsure if she should follow. But something about the way he looked at her, calm, steady, and strangely reassuring, made her get out of the truck. She followed him up the steps and into the house, her heart pounding with every step. The inside of the house was just as unassuming as the outside. The furniture was worn but comfortable, and the walls were lined with books and photographs. Linda couldn't help but notice the pictures, black and white snapshots of a younger Eastwood on movie sets, standing next to icons of Hollywood's golden age. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair by the fireplace. Linda sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt like she was in a dream, one where nothing made sense, but everything felt strangely real. Eastwood took a seat across from her, his piercing blue eyes studying her intently. "Tell me about yourself," he said. Linda blinked, caught off guard by the request. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," he replied. "Your dreams, your struggles, your story. I want to hear it." For a moment, Linda just stared at him, unsure if he was serious. But there was no hint of sarcasm in his voice, no judgment in his eyes. He genuinely wanted to know. And so, for the first time in years, Linda began to talk. She told him about her childhood, her love of writing, and the dreams she'd put on hold. She told him about Tommy, about the struggles of being a single mother, and the constant fear of not being enough. The words poured out of her, raw and unfiltered, as if a dam had burst inside her. Eastwood listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When she finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "You've got a lot of fight in you," he said. "More than you realize." Linda shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm drowning." "That's the thing about strength," he said. "It's not about never falling. It's about getting back up, no matter how many times you get knocked down." Linda wiped her eyes, his words sinking in. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. The flicker of hope Linda felt was quickly overshadowed by a wave of guilt. She couldn't believe she'd unloaded her entire life story on Clint Eastwood, of all people. What had she been thinking? She barely knew him, and yet here she was, sitting in his living room, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to dump all that on you." Eastwood shook his head. "Don't apologize. Sometimes, we all need someone to listen." Linda nodded, though she still felt uneasy. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on a photograph of Eastwood standing next to a young boy. The boy looked familiar, but she couldn't quite place him. "Is that your son?" she asked, pointing to the picture. Eastwood followed her gaze, his expression softening. "That's my grandson," he said. "He's about the same age as your boy." Linda felt a pang of sadness. She didn't know much about Eastwood's personal life, but she'd heard rumors, stories about his family, his struggles, and the losses he'd endured. For a moment, she saw him not as a Hollywood legend, but as a man who'd faced his own share of hardships. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time for a different reason. Eastwood waved a hand dismissively. "No need to apologize. Life's full of ups and downs. What matters is how we handle them." Linda nodded, his words resonating with her. She thought about Tommy, about the sacrifices she'd made for him, and the dreams she'd put on hold. She wanted to believe that things could get better, but it was hard to see a way out of the hole she was in. As if reading her thoughts, Eastwood leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You've got a gift, you know." Linda frowned. "A gift?" You're writing, he said. You said you used to love it. Why'd you stop? Linda hesitated, unsure how to answer. Life got in the way, she said finally. I didn't have the time or the energy. Eastwood nodded, as if he'd expected her to say that. Life has a way of doing that. But sometimes, we have to make time for the things that matter. Otherwise, we lose a part of ourselves. Linda felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't thought about her writing in years, not really. It had always been a dream, something she'd put on the back burner until the right time. But what if the right time never came? Before she could respond, Eastwood stood up and walked over to a bookshelf. He pulled out a worn leather journal and handed it to her. Here, he said. Take this. Linda stared at the journal, confused. What's this for? For your stories, he said. Start writing again. Even if it's just a few sentences a day. Don't let life take that away from you. Linda took the journal, her hands trembling. She didn't know what to say. This man, this legend, was giving her a chance to reclaim a part of herself she'd thought was lost forever. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eastwood nodded, his expression serious. Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning. Linda frowned, unsure what he meant. But before she could ask, he glanced at the clock and sighed. It's getting late, he said. I'll drive you back to the diner. Linda nodded, though she wasn't ready to leave. She felt like she'd just scratched the surface of something important, something that could change her life. But Eastwood was already heading for the door, and she had no choice but to follow. As they drove back to the diner, Linda clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing. She thought about Eastwood's words, about the kindness he'd shown her, and the hope he'd sparked in her heart. For the first time in years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But as they pulled up to the diner, Linda's heart sank. Frank, the manager, was waiting outside, his arms crossed and his face grim. Lynn, he said as she got out of the truck. We need to talk. Linda's stomach dropped. She knew that tone. Something was wrong. Linda's heart pounded as she followed Frank into the diner. The place was empty now, the lunch rush long over, but the tension in the air was palpable. She clutched the journal Eastwood had given her, her mind racing with possibilities. Was she about to lose her job? Had her outburst earlier cost her everything? Frank led her to a corner booth, the same one where Eastwood had been sitting earlier. He gestured for her to sit down, his expression unreadable. Lynn, he began, his voice heavy, I don't know what's going on with you lately, but you've got to get it together. You can't talk to customers like that, especially not someone like him. Linda nodded, her cheeks burning with shame. I know, Frank. I'm sorry. It's just. I've been under a lot of stress, and Frank held up a hand, cutting her off. I get it. Life's tough. But that's no excuse. You're lucky he didn't fire you on the spot. Linda frowned, confused. What do you mean? I thought you said he owns the diner. Frank sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He does. But he's not just the owner, Lynn. He's Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. You know, the guy from all those movies? The one who's won Oscars and directed half of Hollywood? Linda's eyes widened. She'd known Eastwood was a legend, but hearing Frank say it out loud made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. I didn't realize. Of course you didn't, Frank said, his tone softening. He doesn't exactly go around flaunting it. But that's the thing about him, he's humble. He doesn't expect special treatment, but that doesn't mean you can disrespect him. Linda nodded, her stomach churning with guilt. I didn't mean to disrespect him. I wasn't thinking. Frank studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Look, Lynn, I'm not going to fire you. But you've got to be more careful. This job might not seem like much, but it's a lifeline for a lot of people. Don't take it for granted. Linda swallowed hard, his words hitting her like a punch to the gut. She thought about Tommy, about the bills piling up at home, and the sacrifices she'd made to keep food on the table. Frank was right, this job was more than just a paycheck. It was her lifeline. "I'll do better," she said, her voice trembling. "I promise." Frank nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Now, get some rest. You look like you're about to collapse." Linda managed a small smile, though her heart was still heavy. She stood up, clutching the journal to her chest, and headed for the door. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her face, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Eastwood. She couldn't believe she'd snapped at him, at a man who'd not only shown her kindness but had also given her a chance to reclaim her dreams. She felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt, and she knew she had to make things right. The next morning, Linda arrived at the diner early, determined to start fresh. She'd spent the night writing in the journal Eastwood had given her, pouring her heart onto the pages. It had been cathartic, like reopening a door she'd thought was closed forever. As she tied her apron and prepared for the breakfast rush, she kept an eye out for Eastwood, hoping he'd come in again. She wanted to apologize, to thank him, to tell him how much his words had meant to her. But as the hours passed and he didn't show, she began to wonder if she'd missed her chance. It wasn't until the lunch rush that she saw him again. He walked in, just as unassuming as before, and took a seat in the same corner booth. Linda's heart raced as she approached his table, her hands trembling as she poured his coffee. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside her. Eastwood looked up, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. "Afternoon," he said, his tone calm and measured. Linda took a deep breath, summoning all her courage. I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I was out of line, and I'm sorry." Eastwood studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. "Apology accepted." Linda felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she wasn't done. "And I wanted to thank you. For the journal. For listening. For everything." Eastwood nodded, his smile fading into something more serious. "You've got a lot of potential, kid. Don't waste it." Linda felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I won't. I promise." Eastwood held her gaze for a moment longer, as if making sure she meant it. Then he picked up his menu and began to study it, signaling that the conversation was over. Linda stepped back, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Linda. She threw herself into her work at the diner with renewed energy, determined to prove herself. She greeted every customer with a smile, no matter how tired she was, and made sure to go the extra mile whenever she could. But it wasn't just her job that had changed, it was her outlook on life. Every night, after putting Tommy to bed, Linda would sit at the kitchen table with the journal Eastwood had given her. At first, the words came slowly, hesitantly, as if they were afraid to be seen. But as the days turned into weeks, the floodgates opened, and the stories poured out of her. She wrote about her childhood, her dreams, and the struggles of being a single mother. She wrote about hope, resilience, and the power of second chances. It wasn't easy. There were nights when she was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open, and mornings when she wondered if any of it was worth it. But every time she felt like giving up, she thought about Eastwood's words, "You've got a lot of potential, kid. Don't waste it." One evening, as she was closing up the diner, Frank approached her with a curious look on his face. "Lynn, you got a minute?" Linda nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sure, what's up?" Frank handed her a folded piece of paper. "This came for you today." Linda frowned, taking the paper. It was a letter, addressed to her in elegant handwriting. She opened it carefully, her heart skipping a beat as she read the words. "Dear Linda. I've been following your progress, and I must say, I'm impressed. Your dedication and resilience are truly inspiring. I'd like to offer you an opportunity, a chance to share your story with the world. If you're interested, meet me at the address below tomorrow at noon. Sincerely, Clint Eastwood. Linda's hands trembled as she read the letter again, her mind racing. What kind of opportunity was he talking about? And why her? She looked up at Frank, who was watching her with a knowing smile. Well, he said. What are you waiting for? Go home and get some rest. You've got a big day tomorrow. Linda nodded, still in shock. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. The next morning, she dropped Tommy off at school and headed to the address Eastwood had provided. It was a small office building on the outskirts of town, unassuming but well kept. Linda took a deep breath, smoothing her hair and straightening her clothes, before walking inside. The receptionist greeted her with a warm smile. You must be Linda. Mr. Eastwood is expecting you. Right this way. Linda followed her down a hallway, her nerves growing with every step. When they reached a door at the end of the hall, the receptionist knocked lightly before opening it. Linda's here, she announced, before stepping aside to let her in. The office was spacious, but cozy, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large desk by the window. Eastwood was sitting behind the desk, his piercing blue eyes lighting up as she entered. Linda, he said, standing up to greet her. I'm glad you could make it. Linda shook his hand, still feeling a little starstruck. Thank you for inviting me. I wasn't sure what to expect. Eastwood gestured for her to sit down. I'll get straight to the point. I've been impressed by your writing, and I think you've got something special. I'd like to help you publish your work. Linda's eyes widened. Publish my work? But I'm just a waitress. I'm not a real writer. Eastwood leaned forward, his expression serious. Don't sell yourself short. You've got a gift, and it's time the world saw it. I've got connections in the publishing industry, and I'd be happy to introduce you to the right people. Linda felt tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know what to say. Eastwood smiled. Say yes. Linda nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Eastwood leaned back in his chair, looking pleased. Good. We'll start small, maybe a collection of short stories or essays. But I have a feeling this is just the beginning for you. Linda couldn't believe what was happening. It felt like a dream, one she never wanted to wake up from. But as she left the office that day, clutching a folder of notes and ideas, she knew it was real. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Linda's life began to change in ways she could never have imagined. With Eastwood's guidance, she started shaping her journal entries into a collection of short stories. Each piece was deeply personal, drawing from her own experiences as a single mother, a waitress, and a dreamer. The process was both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing on the edge of a cliff and deciding to jump. Eastwood introduced her to a literary agent, a sharp but kind woman named Margaret, who saw potential in Linda's work. Together, they polished the stories, refining the raw emotion into something that could resonate with readers. Linda spent her days at the diner and her nights writing, fueled by a newfound sense of purpose. Tommy noticed the change in his mother. She was happier, more present, and full of energy. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table eating dinner, he looked up at her with curious eyes. "Mom, why are you always writing now?" he asked. Linda smiled, setting down her fork. "I'm working on something special, sweetie. A book." Tommy's eyes widened. "A book? Like the ones we read at school?" "Exactly like that," Linda said, her heart swelling with pride. "Maybe one day, you'll see it in the library." Tommy grinned, clearly impressed. "That's so cool. Can I read it?" Linda laughed. "Not yet. It's still a work in progress. But when it's done, you'll be the first to know." As the weeks turned into months, Linda's confidence grew. She began to see herself not just as a waitress or a mother, but as a writer. The stories she'd once tucked away in notebooks were now taking shape as something real, something that could touch the lives of others. One afternoon, as she was finishing her shift at the diner, Frank called her into his office. "Lynn, I've got some news," he said, his tone serious. Linda's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Frank handed her an envelope. "This came for you today." Linda opened it carefully, her hands trembling. Inside was a letter from a publishing house, offering her a contract for her book. "They want to publish it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Frank smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Looks like you're on your way, kid." Linda felt tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe it. Her dream, the one she'd buried for so long, was finally coming true. That evening, she called Eastwood to share the news. "I did it," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "They want to publish my book." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Eastwood's deep, steady voice came through. "I never had any doubt." Linda laughed through her tears. "Thank you. For everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Eastwood's tone softened. "You did the hard work, Linda. I just gave you a little push." Linda hung up the phone, feeling a surge of gratitude. She thought about how far she'd come, from snapping at a customer in the diner to holding a publishing contract in her hands. It was proof that no matter how hard life got, there was always hope for a new beginning. But as she celebrated her success, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the start. There was still so much she wanted to do, so many stories she wanted to tell. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she had the tools to make it happen. The publication of Linda's book, titled From the Corner Booth, was a turning point not just for her, but for everyone around her. The collection of short stories, each one a raw and heartfelt glimpse into her life, resonated with readers in ways she never expected. People from all walks of life reached out to her, sharing how her words had inspired them, given them hope, or helped them feel less alone. The diner, once just a place where she worked, became a hub of excitement. Regular customers proudly told newcomers, "That's her. That's the author," and Linda would blush, humbled by their support. Frank even started stocking copies of her book by the cash register, and it quickly became a bestseller in their small town. But the impact of Linda's success went beyond the diner. Her story, of a struggling single mother who refused to give up on her dreams, spread like wildfire. Local newspapers picked up her story, and soon, she was invited to speak at community events, schools, and even a few writers' conferences. One of the most meaningful moments came when she visited Tommy's school for a reading. As she stood in front of a room full of wide-eyed children, she felt a surge of pride. Tommy sat in the front row, beaming up at her, and when she finished reading, he jumped up and hugged her in front of everyone. "That's my mom," he declared, and the room erupted in applause. Linda's success also had a ripple effect on those closest to her. Frank, inspired by her determination, started taking night classes to earn his business degree. "If you can chase your dreams, so can I," he told her one day, his voice filled with resolve. Even some of her co-workers at the diner began to pursue their own passions. One started taking painting classes, another enrolled in a culinary school, and a third began writing poetry. Linda's journey had shown them that it was never too late to start over, to chase a dream, or to believe in themselves. But perhaps the most surprising impact was on Clint Eastwood. Though he remained as private as ever, Linda noticed a change in him. He seemed lighter, more at ease, as if her success had brought him a sense of fulfillment. One day, he invited her back to his home, and they sat on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the sunset. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice tinged with pride. Linda smiled, looking out at the horizon. "I couldn't have done it without you." Eastwood shook his head. "You did the hard part. I just gave you a little nudge." Linda turned to him, her expression serious. "You gave me more than that. You gave me hope." And now, I want to do the same for others. Eastwood raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Linda took a deep breath, her mind racing with ideas. I want to start a foundation, a way to help people like me, people who've had to put their dreams on hold. Maybe we can offer scholarships, or mentorship programs, or even just a space for people to share their stories. Eastwood studied her for a moment, his piercing blue eyes filled with admiration. Then he nodded. That's a good idea. A damn good idea. Linda felt a surge of excitement. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. Her journey had taught her that everyone had a story worth telling, and everyone deserved a chance to chase their dreams. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Linda felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She thought about how far she'd come, from snapping at a customer in the diner, to sitting on Clint Eastwood's porch, planning a foundation to help others. It was proof that life was full of surprises, and that even the darkest moments could lead to something beautiful. But as she looked out at the fading light, she knew her journey wasn't over. There was still so much to do, so many lives to touch, and so many stories to tell. The foundation Linda started, called the Corner Booth Project, became her life's greatest work. Named after the place where her journey had truly begun, it aimed to help people who, like her, had been forced to put their dreams on hold. Scholarships were awarded to single parents pursuing education, mentorship programs connected aspiring writers with seasoned authors, and community events provided a platform for people to share their stories. Clint Eastwood became one of the foundation's biggest supporters, though he insisted on staying behind the scenes. "This is your legacy," he told Linda one day. "I'm just here to help." Linda's life was busier than ever, but it was a good kind of busy. Between running the foundation, writing her second book, and spending time with Tommy, she felt like she was finally living the life she was meant to live. One evening, as she was preparing for a fundraising gala, Tommy came into her room, holding a worn-out notebook. "Mom, look what I found," he said, handing it to her. Linda opened the notebook and smiled. It was one of her old journals, filled with stories she'd written before Tommy was born. The pages were yellowed and the ink was faded, but the words still held the same magic. "I didn't know you kept these," she said, her voice soft. Tommy sat down beside her. "I was looking for something to read, and I found this." "You're really good, Mom." Linda felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you, sweetie. That means a lot." Tommy hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Do you think I could be a writer too?" Linda's heart swelled with pride. "Of course you can. You can be anything you want to be." Tommy grinned, clearly pleased. "Maybe we can write a book together someday." Linda pulled him into a hug, her heart full. "I'd love that." The gala that night was a celebration of how far Linda had come and how much she'd accomplished. The room was filled with people whose lives had been touched by her work, single parents who'd gone back to school, aspiring writers who'd found their voice, and community members who'd been inspired to chase their dreams. When it was her turn to speak, Linda stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes landing on Tommy, Frank, and even Clint Eastwood, who sat in the back, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of how it had all begun. "A few years ago," she began, her voice steady, "I was a waitress in a small-town diner, struggling to make ends meet. I'd given up on my dreams, convinced that they were out of reach. But then, something happened. Someone saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. They gave me a second chance, and that changed everything." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "I started the Corner Booth Project because I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone has a story worth telling, and everyone deserves the opportunity to chase their dreams. No matter where you start, no matter how hard life gets, there's always hope for a new beginning." The room erupted in applause, and Linda felt a surge of gratitude. She thought about how far she'd come, from snapping at a customer in the diner to standing on that stage, surrounded by people who believed in her. As the night came to an end, Eastwood approached her, his eyes filled with pride. "You've done good, kid," he said, his voice gruff but warm. Linda smiled, her heart full. Thank you. For everything. Eastwood shook his head. Don't thank me. You did the hard part. Linda knew he was right. She had done the hard part. But she also knew that she couldn't have done it alone. It had taken kindness, support, and a little bit of hope to get her where she was today. As she looked out at the crowd, she felt a sense of peace. Her journey wasn't over, there were still stories to tell, lives to touch, and dreams to chase. But for the first time in her life, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. And that was the greatest gift of all.